on the side of right. It's the only legacy I want to leave. It's a legacy of service. So I'm glad for this opportunity. I'll start off by sharing something with you and have you ruminate on it for a while, and we'll get back to it in a little while. When your hut is on fire, you don't chase after a rat when your hut is on fire. The world is in trouble. America is in trouble. And we're chasing after things like diversity, equity, inclusion, affirmative action. Tried and proven wrong historically. Interventions. And your hut is on fire. A little bit about my story. I was born in Cameroon in a small National Geographic grass hut village. And for those who have read my book, and those who will, and I hope you do, it outlines that journey that leads me to this podium. And I was raised by two conservative, illiterate, Christian subsistence farmers who I refer to as my God-given disciplinarians. And it was in that hut, in that grass hut village, and you'll see a picture of it in my book, that I learned the true essence of life and living in an individual concept and also in a broader perspective of society in general. And I was taught many important values that I still embrace today and have enabled me to navigate the challenges of life, as we all know, individually and collectively. And what are those concepts? Hard work and the pursuit of excellence. If my loincloth didn't look clean enough and symmetric enough, my mother asked me to get back in the hut and do better. You're not leaving the hut till you look right. If I didn't stand straight and poised and look her in the eyes as I spoke with her, she walked away. I learned discipline. I learned to work hard. There was no excuse. And I learned to be the best that I could be in whatever I did. And this wasn't hard. And I learned that I was not living alone in the village. What affects one affects all. The African term for that is Ubuntu. You've probably heard about that. I am because you are. And yes, it takes a village. When you embrace that concept, you understand what it means by taking a village. And so many of our politicians in this great nation have hijacked that expression, but don't understand the full meaning of it takes a village. And if it really took a village, I wouldn't be on this podium today. People will face the truth. I don't address what I perceive as discrimination by injecting discrimination. You don't treat a fever, an infection, by dripping poison bacteria into a patient's veins. It's crazy, isn't it? Just the whole idea. And I learned humility. Humility, as I've often defined, it's not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. The other person matters. Because if the other person matters, we matter. I learned gratitude. Wherever you are in this world, somebody helped you to get there. So we cannot stand by and watch events unfold around us that impact others' lives, including ours, and do nothing about it. And I learned forgiveness. It's wrong for me to accuse you of the wrongs of your ancestors, because your ancestors were my ancestors. We're all connected in Ubuntu. And so with those values, armed with those values, I was ready for the world. And I didn't know it then. But then something happened. I saw my cousin, who was a few years older than I. He had enrolled in an elementary school. And in those days, we had very few options for elementary school. In the entire province where I'd come from, there were maybe about 3 elementary schools. And they were mostly missionary schools. I wanted to go to school because there was something about him that transformed him completely. He was about 4 years older than I, but he came back using words I'd never heard of, in a language I was unaware of. The missionaries, many of whom a lot of you supported, were teaching those kids. He sang songs that I'd never heard of. I was 3 years old, and I was crying and complaining and agitating every day that I wanted to go to school. My parents said, "You're too young." No. As you read about it in the book, I practiced what I always refer to as importunity, persistence. I knew, just like in the Bible, when the man was knocking on the door late at night, his neighbor is in bed, asleep, and he kept knocking. He says, "What do you want?" "I'm asleep. My wife and my children were all, it's late at night." And he kept knocking. He says, "I've got 3 strangers that showed up. I don't have any food. I have no bread." And the reason he kept knocking, importunity, because he knew there was bread in there. I knew that if I continued to agitate, my parents will capitulate. And indeed they did. And I wound up starting elementary school at about age 3. And it transformed my life. And I embarked on a journey learning new things. And as I've always said, I moved away essentially psychologically from the village. I was there, my body was there, but my mind was roaming the world. Yes, I read about the prairies. I read about Kitty Hawk and so many of the great geographies that I've gotten to experience firsthand. I read about humanity in a positive sense. Eventually, I would have to make those connections. But unfortunately, one day I was coming back from school, and in the village path, I ran into an uncle of mine. His name is Simon, and you read about him in the book. And like most villagers, he was always so cheerful. And like most villagers, the first thing they ask a child when they see, "How is school? How is school? How are you doing in school?" But he looked troubled, and I said, "What's the matter?" He says, "Your mother needs blood. She went to the hospital to give birth." My mother, I ran off to the hospital. They only had one hospital in the province. general hospital, and they only had one doctor at the hospital. And I remember walking into that hospital room, and clearly, to my right, there's a nurse. She's crying, her arms, lifting her arms up in the air, and all she kept repeating, "There's no doctor, there's no doctor." And I looked to my left, and I saw my mother in profound distress, blood flowing out of her groin, down the side of the bed, making a puddle beneath on the floor. She had given birth to my little brother, and she was bleeding profusely. Nurse didn't know what to do, the poor nurse. And a hospital without resources. It was a hospital in name. When I say hospital, your imagination immediately takes you to UNC Medical Center or Duke. No, for those of you who have traveled to developing countries, you may understand what I'm talking about. And I ran across to my mother, held her hand, and squeezed her leg. "You're 10 years old." And she hears my voice, and immediately she goes, "Son, go home, I'm dying." She says in the language, "Go home, I'm dying." And I says, "Mommy, please don't die." The title of this book. And she kept repeating the same thing, "Son, go home." She didn't want me to see her. She knew the end was near. She was only about 30 years old, if that. And she went on to die. I was the last person she spoke to, and those were the last words I shared with her. And as I left the hospital, trekking back to the village, in the woods, those words kept ringing in my ear. There's no doctor. And that's the day that I decided that I wanted to be a doctor. I didn't know what a doctor did, but it sounds to me like somebody who saves lives. I'd never seen. Most natives had never seen a doctor. I wanted to be a doctor so no child would have to experience what I just experienced, and no parent would have to suffer like my mother has just suffered before dying. It would not be long before I enrolled in the most exclusive missionary secondary school, Sacred Heart College. I skipped a grade because there was no room in the first year, so I joined the class in the second year. And you can imagine what that entailed from elementary school. I'd already skipped a few grades in elementary school. And I worked hard. I flunked every test the first month at least. I was the butt of all jokes in the class. Many of my classmates, some of whom I speak to on a daily basis, still remember. I was a poor kid from the village, didn't have shoes. And yes, I was in the class with sons of diplomats and this, that, and the other. But those concepts that I had gleaned from talking to my parents, learned hard work, persistence, excellence. I studied. I worked my butt off. And eventually, I graduated at the top of my class. Gratitude. Those missionaries from Scotland, from America, from India, from all over the world who sacrificed so much to help transform our lives. One of them was a Peace Corps volunteer from the US. I described him in the book. All I remember is he was a redhead. That really stood out because there were no redheads in Africa. And I would steal books because I couldn't afford. And I can't go into the details because it's hard for me to read the book that I wrote. Because my folks, illiterate, my dad was still alive, obviously. Mama died. He was in the Depression. We lived in a hut. He could barely afford my tuition. I get dismissed so often. And I would leave the campus with my books and I'll study back in the village. Then I'll go and harvest pineapples and oranges, whatever I could, and trek 10 miles away to the city and sell them and keep accumulating some money. A couple of weeks later, I go back to the campus to the missionary, Brother John Phillips from England. And he'll say, okay, you can re-enroll and you got to pay the rest of your tuition. And I had to steal books. One, I couldn't afford the books. Two, the small library that we had with donations, books donated from philanthropists like yourself. You had to wait 2-3 months to borrow a book. So I resorted to stealing. I was a book thief. But I always returned the books after I read them. And this American Peace Corps volunteer, the redhead, took a liking to me. And he says, son, I'll give you books. And he started to feed me books. I'm sure he wrote his family, his friends in the U.S., send me wherever you have. And I read. The more I read, the more I became fascinated with this place called America. And I wanted to go to America. It got to a point where the kids would call me the American because it was the land of opportunity. And he's the one that told me, he says, son, you need to consider going to college in America. He says, if you work hard, 2 words, you will be successful. Work hard. Because that's what America was all about. They had sent people to the moon. It was the ultimate destination for anybody who wanted to make something of their lives. And the day came when I graduated. I got admission to an American school. My father says, how do you get there? Just think about it. He's in a village, he can't read or write. His concept of the world is, it's flat, maybe. I mean, you take him back to maybe the 16th century. And before that, 14th century. And he says, how do you get there? I says, you got to fly in a plane, you know. How much does that cost? It's $300 for a one-way ticket. He says, okay. So he sold our family land, the crops and everything, and got exactly $300. It was 140,000 francs. And then the entire tribe got together in a hut, many of whom are still alive today. My aunt, who actually lives in Iowa, often talks about this with her daughter. She's almost 90. And they donated a total of 10,000 francs. And you know how much that is in US dollars? $20. And that's what they gave me, the $20. And for this kid, 14 years old, barely, on his way to America, and I landed in New York City. $20. You talk about growing up disadvantaged? Yes. You understand why I joined this fight? That's an excuse. I've yet to meet a single kid who had gone through what I went through. I was not the exception. And I'm not. But I grew up battling roaches, sinking sanctuary in my ears, rats nibbling on my toes as I slept on the bamboo bed. You'll see a picture of it in the book. Snakes, I've been bitten many times. There was no refrigerator, running water, electricity. You want a drink? There's a stream 2 miles away. There's no time for frivolity. No Michael Jordan sneakers. I steal books because I couldn't afford it. Couldn't afford them. Excellence. And yes, I arrived in America. It was not easy. Stayed at the YMCA in Baltimore. I'd been scammed out of my $20 in a JFK, a Good Samaritan. America's the best place in the world. Good Samaritan helped me out. He wasn't a Cameroonian. He wasn't an African. He was just somebody with a kind heart. And yes, I cried every day in the YMCA, drinking water from the faucet. And another Good Samaritan sent out a clarion call in Baltimore and asked if somebody would be willing to house a homeless student from Africa. And someone heeded the call. And I spent a year sleeping on his couch in Baltimore. His name is Sam. He was the best man at my wedding. He's still alive. And after a year, another Good Samaritan, an Irish professor of chemistry, said, "Son, you're too smart for this school." He wasn't pulling any punches. He says, "You need to move to Boston. You're a poor student. You're working." I used to tutor. Odd jobs, janitor. He says, "If you go to Boston, there are a lot of industries there, a lot of factories, a lot of students, a lot of schools, good schools. And you'll be able to enroll in school and work at the same time. Put yourself through school, and you'll make it to medical school." I suffered, working 2-3 jobs. Eventually, I got a bachelor's degree and went on to get a PhD in chemistry, a master's at Harvard, and then medical school. And then after that, my residency at the Cleveland Clinic and Harvard Medical School for cardiothoracic. I went back to Boston. It was not an easy route. I never had any self-pity or wallowed in the self-pity. Oh, there's a new term now, victimology. As a doctor, I rather use the term victimyelitis, because myelitis is a terrible condition involving your nervous system, your nerves. And blaming others. And when I was in college, one of the things that I did to survive was tutor. I took abstract algebra. I realized that for a kid who'd come from Africa with minimal resources, I couldn't understand why so many of these other kids didn't understand the concepts. They were smart. I mean, when you talk to them, and so I tutored math, but I still couldn't figure out why they would have so many great resources, yet they were so unprepared for college. They all have full scholarships. I had to tutor and run in my beat-up Volkswagen, drive all the way up to New Hampshire to a factory where I would work till about midnight, and then come home and do homework, and then be in class again in the morning. But he had full scholarship. Some of them got it, but unfortunately, really nice students, a lot of them quit. They didn't graduate. They got frustrated. And I went to medical school, same thing. I was tutoring in medical school. Medical school was rough. Are there any doctors in the room? You study, you commit at least 120 hours a week. You go sometimes through textbooks in a week. It's fast-paced, speed of light. It wasn't easy. But a lot of us did fine because we were prepared. And when some of the students I would tutor were still struggling. They had bachelor's degrees, but they were still struggling. They were not prepared. They had gotten in through affirmative action process. It's not fair to them. They're smart kids. It could happen to any of us. If I had not been prepared, I would have struggled myself. Some of them had to quit. Some took the most circuitous route to graduation, 5 years, 6 years instead of the usual 4. And what's more, some of them couldn't even pass the board exams. So you got to get residency. What's the use going through 4 years of medical school, but you can't go into residency? And that's where, the rubber hits the road. Residency. It's not where you went to medical school. They don't teach you a different way to treat pneumonia in North Dakota than they do in Boston. It's the same thing. But the residency where you specialize, a lot of them couldn't even get into residency because they just didn't have the qualifications at that point. The grades, they didn't meet the cutoff. Because they struggled. Excellence, the only banner that my parents would have me carry. And I look back and I says, it brought value to me. It was something that was missing in their lives. Excellence. And so, when I graduated, I decided I wanted to help give back. And so I got involved. And to this day, I still do mentoring at the elementary school and high school level. Because what I discovered was the problem in our educational system, this whole quarters, this whole affirmative action, is that we'll fail to see where the problem is. You do not treat a fever with Tylenol and wash your hands and walk away. If you have a lung abscess and you have a fever and you get Tylenol, you feel better. But if you don't treat the root cause, you're dead. And if you wait too long and the infection gets into your bloodstream and you get that thing you've heard about, sepsis, your mortality is 50 to 75%. Turn around and look at America from that perspective. These quick fixes to satisfy a political agenda. Who are the true victims? Who are the beneficiaries? And so many of the kids, even in Philadelphia, that I would mentor, I would say, you're so smart. They were reading at the level of a third grader in Africa, where the kid, English is probably the African kids, for the African kid, the fourth, fifth language. When I got to America, I could barely understand what a lot of people were saying. And I says, I want to speak English like any of the top students. Excellence. And when I got a job as a cardiothoracic surgeon, it wasn't an easy road, as you can imagine. You read in the book. I don't want to spare you the emotional distress tonight. I wanted to be hired to serve humanity, not because of the hue that I brought to the table, but because of the abilities, the skill, excellence. Because medicine, you have a fiduciary responsibility as a human being, male or female, to take care of the most important thing anybody owns, is their body. And are you going to compromise to meet some social agenda? And I think it's really evil. The house, the hut is on fire, and you're chasing after a rat. And so affirmative action issues, what have they done? They've destroyed lives. Now, it may have helped if you were a bright kid, and we know our history in the past has not been the cleanest. We all know that. There's no nation that has got clean hands when it comes to human relations, but I can tell you this great nation has come a long way. We're not where we were, where our parents were, where our great-grandparents were. So let's celebrate progress, not perfection. and look for better ways to do better. But how does that solve a problem if I discriminate against him when he's qualified to assuage somebody else's pain? As I've always said, treating generational pain and suffering by injecting generational guilt. That's how you destroy society. And so affirmative action has not helped. It has created this entitlement. And I said this in Philadelphia and in Pittsburgh when I was running for governor of Pennsylvania just a year ago. And I said it in South Philly, my brothers and sisters. I stand here today because they didn't hang me from a rooftop. Because it resonated with them. They knew I was right. I said, it's destroyed you. I was in Philadelphia about a year ago. Our campaign stopped, South Philly. This hall was filled, minorities, Hispanic and African Americans. And I said, look at you. Your neighborhoods are crumbling. Your education, the education your kids are getting is the worst. They're scared to go to school. There's crime in the streets. You can't even leave your house. Your health care is the worst in the state. Your brothers and sisters who live up in Elk County, who happen to be white, what do they got to do with this? I said, you're believing in a system that seeks to destroy you. They need to get back to the root cause of the problem in the United States of America. UNC, if you look at North Carolina, the population, and I have to use specific, and I don't usually talk about race, because racism and all this nonsense is a human creation. We're all the same race, human race, period. We all have different shades. That's all melanin. With scalpels, I've cut through thousands of people. We all bleed red. We're all God's children. But just for sake of clarity, I'll talk about race. North Carolina, with an African American or black population of about 25%. Asian population, 3%. And if you look at the demographics, for those 25 and older, about 25% of them who are African American or black have less than a high school diploma. Well, they didn't finish high school. And what are the statistics in the white community? About 12%. That's staggering. And if you look at the high school graduation rate, Asians in North Carolina, 95%. Whites, 90%. African Americans, best statistics, 83%. It's not discrimination. It's bad policies. Not only that, I'm a physician. What's the percentage of black doctors in North Carolina? At best, 5%. And really, those are national numbers. Wherever you go, South Carolina prides itself of having more, 6%. But the African American population in South Carolina is about 35%. So go figure. And guess what? Those are the same statistics, the 5% I talk about, we've had in 100 years. If you look at the graduation rate, the percentage of folks who don't even finish high school, and the historical perspective of this number that is not changing. And you know, affirmative action has been here for decades. And all these measures, we've thrown billions of dollars and we're looking in the wrong place. And oftentimes, the solutions are not as complex. It's just that you have to work hard when you have to deal with the root cause. So you have to scapegoat if you're the one crafting policies. You have to look at North Carolina UNC, and you got to say, you got to hire a neuroscientist who's black. That's unethical. I want the most qualified doctor, and it's not fair to the black person that you hire, because you make them a pariah. Let me tell you right now, there's something called empathy. Put yourself in the other person's shoes, not sympathy. If I'm the most qualified person, I feel I am, and you hired Ken instead to work with me or be my boss or whatever, I'll never be comfortable. It's human nature. In my own nature, I will never hurt him, but you've created a static, polarization, acrimony. Does that solve? No. And the problem with static polarization, acrimony, is that it just expands over time. It gets worse. And we're not making progress. There are problems in the state. North Carolina, UNC, the question should be, do they want to be the number one in affirmative action in America? Do they want to be number one in checklist? What is a checklist? Diversity, inclusion. Did you do this? Did you provide garage space for the Latinos? Oh, good. Or do you want to be number one in healthcare outcomes? When you go to that hospital, you want to come back home alive and well and restored. If your infection rate is through the roof, your mortality is through the roof, your length of stay is through the roof, your access is poor, you're not a healthcare organization. That's where your focus should be, naturally. And yes, we all have power. UNC has power. It's up to you how you use your power. And I think, in my opinion, I don't live here, but we're connected. We're all human beings. What happens here affects me. And everybody in this room is my brother and sister. So I can say categorically, if I'm speaking to UNC, the power that you have, you can use it to address this problem with all the intellectual might collectively that you have. Over history, this quarter problem, by working with the legislature, the leadership in the state to address it at its core. Primary school education, kindergarten. That's where it starts with those kids. The most educated minority in America is Nigerians. The most educated minority, looking at it as a group, is Africans. You didn't know that, some of you. College graduates, advanced degrees, 45% of African immigrants. Next is Asians, 43%. Next is those of European heritage, Russia, Canada, 28%. And US-born graduates, 22%. And if you go back and you look at that cohort, Nigerians, and why do I say, the last time I checked, most Nigerians are black people, right? And you start looking at how crazy this whole affirmative action thing is. Nigerians are the most educated minority in America. 60% with advanced degrees. Some of you know them. They work their asses off. PhDs, MDs, master's degree. And if you just go through advanced degrees, just like the PhDs, the MDs, in that cohort, about 30%. And the rest of the population is what? Including our brothers and sisters, white Americans, who dominate, actually, 11%. People have said, so what makes you Nigerians and you? Because they grow up as children not thinking less of, they don't have this self-pity philosophy or syndrome that's been perpetrated down the line. Work hard. And what did I say when I saw my uncle on that village path that afternoon? He didn't ask me something that everyone in the village would ask a child. How is school going? And just that shift, I knew something was terribly wrong. And when they asked somebody, why are you Nigerians so successful? In Nigeria, you're raised to be competitive, to strive for excellence. And the only thing the elders, the mothers, the aunts, the uncles, the villagers, it takes a village, would ask you, how's school? So you realize there's one thing you have to do, is to work hard to be somebody. In the American system too, we all talk about college, college, college. Not everybody, and I include minorities, majority, not everybody needs to follow the classic pathway of high school, college. Vocational school. And what I'm getting at is that it allows people to be empowered. And last night, I was riding with Kenny. He's dropping me off at the hotel. And I was telling him, I said, you know, you look at the Chinese immigrants, Korean immigrants, they show up in America. They've been sailing this uncharted sea. They arrive here with nothing. They set up shop. They're selling trinkets. They're opening restaurants. They're doing this. They have a vocation. And then they're well undergirded. They have a strong foundation from which now they can launch their kids into academia. With that philosophy, undergirded with that philosophy of hard work. That's missing in a lot of the minority communities. And our politicians who have let us down in many ways use those communities for political ascendancy. And this has been perpetrated so badly over the years and decades that it's become imbued in their DNAs. So the first reaction to any kind of adversity was racism, 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 racism. And then many of us, UNC, unfortunately and sadly, despite their intellectual might, kowtow to that. Instead of saying no. And last night I told him, I says, we're driving, I says, if I was the CEO of UNC, the first thing I would say is, I would rather quit this job today than put the future of an African American child in jeopardy. That's leadership. And I says, say that. And the rest of the world wouldn't know what to say after that. Because that's what it's all about. I want the best doctor when I go to the hospital. I don't care what race they are. When I grab that scalpel and I'm looking down at your chest, when you went to sleep, you had to have comfort within you that this man is going to take care of my heart. I only have one heart, and they're going to do an excellent job, not a good job. Excellence trumps diversity any day. Take that to the bank. We have gone through the agrarian revolution, folks, the industrial revolution, and guess where we are now? We're in a knowledge-based economy, global economy, and people are still thinking provincially. UNC, and I have to say UNC because Duke and all these other enclaves of academia, it's called denial in psychology. They know it's wrong. but they're still embracing provincial thinking. We're in a knowledge-based global economy. I tell you what, there's no affirmative action in global commerce. If you're a big microchip manufacturing Dutch company and you're looking to hire an executive or a manager who happens to be American, do you say, are you Hispanic? Or, are you Jewish? Or are you? No, you want the best. America is not the America of our parents. It's global. And in that global arena, highly competitive, we've got to prepare our children to survive. Because when we do, America survives. The American dominance will be lost. And in a sad way, thank God, we'll all be dead, hopefully, by the time it's lost, so we don't live to see how we allowed this great thing that our ancestors built to be destroyed. China is a few steps behind us. Their GDP, go home and read about it. The news media lies to us. They don't want to face that. The same people that complain because now the Asians used to be the model minorities because they excel, they work hard. But when their numbers go up, they're no longer the model minority, and people start moving away from the neighborhood because they're breaking the curve. They're making it very uncomfortable for their children. There was an article I shared yesterday out of Atlanta, and where people were moving away to Forsyth County because the school system, there were too many Asian kids who were doing so well and excelling. Parents were worried about the self-esteem of their kids, and all of a sudden the kids were not going to get into good colleges because it's so competitive. You know? Read up on it. Johns Creek was the town. Yeah. Cupertino, California, 2 high schools have seen a precipitous drop in their, and I call it the liberal white population. And the complaint is that the growing Asian community. But what represents the American spirit more than that? That's a spirit that our parents had, right? All of us. For all of us to be here today enjoying these liberties and freedom and opportunities. Work hard. And I say liberals because those are liberal policies that seek to destroy us. And it's kind of funny, and oftentimes people say, look at a guy like me and where he came from. You say, liberals? Yes. The conservative values in America is what made the world, built the world. China was built by this country. Europe was built by this country. We enjoy that. Thomas Edison, who had nothing, maybe a third grade education, the banner he carried was excellence. And if you look at even Clarice Phelps, some of you have probably read about her, African-American young lady who has participated in discovering one of the newest elements in the periodic table, element 117, 117. She didn't sit around crying prejudice and racism. And even at the event to celebrate the discovery of this new element in the periodic table called tennessine, they forgot to put a plaque of her name on it. She didn't go to the media crying racism and this, that, and the other. She complained. The group apologized. People make mistakes. We live in a different world. Vivian Thomas, You've probably heard about this. A black man who had a high school education, had wanted to go to medical school, but during the Great Depression, lost all his money. He'd worked hard. And he was hired as a janitor in a laboratory at Vanderbilt University to take care of the animals, you know. Alfred Blaylock was the doctor scientist. But he saw something in this young man. And before long, he was doing all the experiments. He was dissecting the animals, doing the experiments. And so when Blaylock had a job offer somewhere, and he says, well, I have this black assistant. Well, you can't bring any blacks. Well, I'm not taking your job. And then John Hopkins came calling. And he took him up there. And they worked hard. He set up the laboratory. And he must have looked like an anomaly on the Hopkins campus, a black male in 1940 walking around with a long white coat. And then a lady, Helen Taussig, a cardiologist, had had all these children, blue baby syndrome, dying after childbirth because they couldn't get enough oxygen in their bodies. They have abnormalities in their heart, holes in their heart and stuff. Stuff that these days I walk into surgery and in 45 minutes I can fix. I stand on the shoulders of those giants. And when her clinic would be filled with babies, blue-looking babies. All of them are going to die. This new surgeon shows up at Hopkins, Alfred Blaylock, and she goes, can you find a way, some type of operation to save these babies' lives? He came back to his assistant, and he told him, he says, we need to come up with a procedure to help out. Vivian Thomas, the little African-American young man, he had developed the technique, the operation. On that fateful day in the 1940s, they took a blue baby to the operating room at Hopkins and performed a procedure that would be named Blaylock-Taussig shunt after Dr. Alfred Blaylock and Helen Taussig, the cardiologist. And if you look at the documentary, standing behind him is this black man in the operating room telling him exactly what to do because he had done more than his boss had. But he was respectful of his boss, and his focus was not on the events surrounding him, the implications of him not being there doing the operation. It was the baby. Hopkins, about 3 decades later, would honor him. And if you ever walked into the atrium at Johns Hopkins Hospital, you will see a huge, like a banner, painting of Vivian Thomas alongside Dr. Blaylock. And when I was a student at Harvard, training, actually in pediatric heart surgery, by the most preeminent professor in the world, Aldo Castaneda. And I did so many of those procedures, Blaylock-Taussig shunts. And I would travel to Southeast Asia, Cambodia, to Brazil, to Ecuador, to Chad, up in the desert, South Africa, Kenya, doing these operations. I didn't know about Vivian Thomas. He was omitted in the textbooks of surgery. But then, if you open up a textbook of surgery now and read up on that operation, you may not recognize it if you hadn't seen this book in 30 years, because it's now called the Blaylock-Taussig shunt. This is not a bad country. We continue to make progress. That's the point I'm making. You can't look back on our history with disdain. You will not have a bright future if you do. We're moving at jet-lag speed as Americans. We can't start creating and fostering disharmony with policies that don't work, have failed categorically over the years. Most black doctors don't want to be treated special. They want to be treated as equals. A recent statistic shows that. The vast majority of Americans don't want this whole diversity and equity nonsense, affirmative action. We're in a different time now. The question is, why are these Nigerians succeeding? The question is, why are these Chinese succeeding? Is there something we can learn? You don't chase after a mouse when the hut is on fire. And let me share something with you as I come to the end here from my book. I sat down 2020 and spilled my guts in this book. Every word of it I wrote. And I like to look at all the problems that we have in terms of your health. This type of acrimony and polarization that you instigate and promote, that UNC has been put in a position to do, creates health problems in people. Because health is not just about physical health, it's about mental health, and it's about social health. In all our experiences, hate is too great a burden to bear. And injecting hate can lead to poor health. And that's why in my book I say violence of any kind is a public health problem. Discrimination, no matter who is perpetrated against, is a public health problem. Substandard housing is a public health problem. Economic disparity is a public health problem. And yes, substandard education is a public health problem. That's what UNC should be focusing on. In every social determinant of health status, the poor minorities in this country have been fooled, deceived. Nutrition, housing, employment, education, genetics, clean water, safety, security. The poor of every race, creed, and color, they come up short. Chronic diseases disproportionately affect poor black, brown, and white folks. When one looks at all these seemingly overwhelming challenges, the two mutually inclusive fundamental interventions that can address most of them, directly or otherwise in our communities, are educational and economic empowerment, which must begin at an early age. The problem we have is a pipeline problem. It's a supply chain problem. They're trying to say you need to hire a neuroscientist who's black. Because when you look at the spectrum of neuroscientists at the hospital, there's no black there. You're treating a symptom, not the problem. You need to get to the problem. You need to say, what's wrong with the pipeline? How come we don't have enough of them? There's 3% of them here, Asians, but there's 17% of them, in the doctor corps. They don't have a pipeline problem. And for 100 years, my brothers and sisters, the numbers of African American doctors have not changed. For 100 years, our brains can't come up with a reason and a solution. It's easy. And I go further in the book here, and I talk about it. With $20 in my pocket, I landed on the shores of this great nation and discovered the true land of opportunity. While I have made countless mistakes along the way, I have learned an important lesson that growing up disadvantaged does not have to be a permanent condition. Because of what America truly represents, I now have every advantage of having grown up disadvantaged. The transition from being disadvantaged, and this is the key, to having advantages hinges on individual resolve and community or family abetment. If you look at the communities that were trying to squeeze their numbers in this affirmative action conundrum, you see individually, education is not sexy in many of our minority communities. Period. Their leaders don't want to say that. Their leaders have betrayed them. Actually, many of the leaders are self-serving narcissists. They're on television. They don't want to face the truth. Secondarily, parents have to have skin in the game for success. When my uncle meets me in a village path and he doesn't ask me, how's school? I know something is wrong. That's something that has to happen in our communities here in Chapel Hill, and in Boston, in South Philly, in Newark, New Jersey. And so our local policymakers, statewide policymakers, countrywide, have gone wrong. So we need to stand up and say, no, it's no. We're not going to put the future of our nation, our children, in jeopardy, because any child is our child. It takes a village. A child in Seattle, a child in Orlando, Florida, a child here in Chapel Hill, O'Reilly, it's my child. They're all our children. There comes a time when people need to straighten their backs up and say, no is no, because we have to be on the right side of history. And I always like to share this poem with people to remind them that what we perceive as differences between us are really artifacts. They're not real. I've been inside the human body, cut people in half and put them together on almost every continent. And yes, sometimes I've walked into a village in northern Cambodia where they've never seen somebody in my hue. And they may call me in jest Michael Jordan, because that's the only person they could probably relate to, a name that may seem familiar to this area where we are. And I would laugh, and before you know it, the kids are all over me, sitting on my lap. There's no difference between me and them, just geography. We need to remind ourselves that hiring somebody of a different color over somebody who's as qualified or even more qualified is wrong. It disconnects us, and we need each other. And so I'll remind you about what John Donne, this metaphysical poet from England, said about 400 years ago. No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. And then he went on to say, any man's death diminishes me because I'm involved in mankind. So never ask to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. That bell tolls for all of us sitting here today. We've got to bring an end to this nonsense and save the future of our children, and let children know that the best banner they can carry in their lives is a banner of excellence, not a banner of color or ethnicity. I love you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'd be glad to welcome any questions you may have. Just open this up to discussion. Yes, sir.
The conundrum is that the left controls the newspapers, TV, Hollywood, education, just go right down the list. And half of the U.S. feels one way and the other half feels another way. I have friends, as everybody else does, who lean the other way.
Right.
And I'm not going to give them up, but they brainwash themselves every morning. They open up the New York Times or the Washington Post, or they turn on NPR. How do we ever get over that hump?
Yes, yes. I look at it as evil, and I'm a surgeon. Do even better. All the issues and the problems and the poor outcomes, that stuff could be done. I took over the Institute. They were one of the worst in Pennsylvania, and as you Google and see, don't read my book for that, be objective. We became #1. The only program that came close was the University of Pittsburgh, neck and neck, with a mortality of 0.4% in cardiac surgery. You can take that to the bank. And don't shine the spotlight on me. It's a team, high performance team. I had the best around me. It's not about me. I alone couldn't do it. High performance team. Not kowtowing to anybody. I didn't care what the CEO said. As a matter of fact, when you read in my book, he got fired because he didn't embrace that same philosophy of excellence I did. And so we were at loggerheads. And somebody on the board of trustees had to make a decision, because that person understood that in the battle of the elephants is the grass that hurts. And that grass is the patience. And he didn't want a battle going on. So he had to remove one of the elephants out of there to save the grass. That's what UNC needs to focus on. Not being the best. Yeah, I don't mind. They can be the #1 football team or basketball team in the country. That's great. We need sports. But that can't take precedence over the most important thing. The high incidence of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, maternal mortality in North Carolina. I have the statistics. Among the same population that you're trying to help, that instead of helping them get more kids to like school, go to school, get families engaged in the education of their kids, so more in their numbers become doctors and spread out and fan out in the community and save lives to address this diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, maternal mortality, which in their community is twice that of whites. That's what you do as a leader. That's why I say how you use your power is up to you. That's what UNC needs to do.
Imagine if UNC chose their doctors like they choose their quarterback.
That's powerful.
We'll have one more question, because I know you guys have to go.
Well, let's get 2 questions then.
More of a personal question.
Yes.
Have you come to know Dr. Ben Carson in all your travels?
No, I spoke to Ben. As you know, in 2002, Ben had prostate cancer. I read about him, and I read his book. He inspired me when I was a kid in college. And so that time I was at the Guthrie Clinic then. I was director of surgery. And this morning in my medical journal, I read, and I picked up the phone and called him at Johns Hopkins, where he was, and I said a prayer with him on the phone, and I wished him well. But I never saw him again after that. And so when I ran for governor of Pennsylvania a year and a half ago, somebody reached out to him about getting us together, but he think he was well. There was a problem, and I never got a chance to. So unfortunately, yeah, it's somebody I truly admire. And you know, he's one of those people that speak truth. And sad to say, let me tell you what has happened in the community. He has a lot of animosity, even in his own community. You know what I mean? Even though, yeah, Clarence Thomas, he has spine. And you look at them, these are folks who grew up disadvantaged. Ben Carson almost killed somebody, you know, as a kid. And he got the come to Jesus moment, and he goes, oh my gosh, I got to focus on my education. They weren't privileged. They came from disadvantage to advantage because of the great nation in which we live, America. You can't do that easily in China, in Russia. I've traveled the world, in Brazil. And everywhere I go, the U.S. Embassy, there's 10-mile long lines for people trying to come in here. There's a reason why.
I want to make sure, before we end, I want to make
I
sure
think
that...
she has a question. Maybe we'll get hers now.
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
Well, first of all, I want to say I really appreciate the fact that you came here knowing nothing of our language and how much you were able to achieve. I come from a family, most of you are Hungarians. They don't speak Hungarian here. So there's a little bit of connection as far as the difficulty there. But I'm also kind of wondering, now I see a lot of stuff by Stephen Gundry, and he's always promoting the fact that he's created that equipment that keeps your heart beating while you're...
Right.
How does what you do compare or not with what...
Steve was at Emory University when I was at Cleveland Clinic. He's a cardiothoracic surgeon as well. And he moved to Arizona. He left surgery because he realized that he was treating chronic disease. And you'll be hearing a little bit more. I've stopped operating. I'm only going to operate as a missionary, travel the world and do free surgery. There are a lot of babies dying all over the world, and there's very few heart surgeons in the world, and especially those that do pediatric. And that's what I want to do the rest of my life, to serve humanity. But also, I've spent my life, I've always asked, where did we go wrong when we get a 25-year-old, 30-year-old who shows up with a massive heart attack? I say, we missed something. And everything sends signals. There was a great guy in 431 BC, Thucydides, who wrote the history of the Peloponnesian Wars. And he made a statement in that book that still resonates with me. He says, coming events cast their shadows. And so I says, I want to know, before that shadow is cast, I want to know when there's going to be a problem in that 30-year-old when they're 15 years old, and address it. So I came up with this concept of interceptive medicine, and I'll just talk about it briefly. And so we're going to be opening up, and the reason we moved to Florida is that we're going to start a clinic. It's going to be preventive. It's not preventive medicine. It's even bigger than preventive medicine, because we have the wherewithal now to make your health span equal to your lifespan, and avoid all these chronic debilitating diseases, diabetes, arthritis, cardiac disease, cancers. And there are tests now.
Here we go. Here's what I want you guys to do. We have a petition circulating right now. It is on preventing UNC medicine from going down to wokeness, from bowing down to wokeness. And I want to be very clear with what we intend this petition to do. With your signatures and the signatures of North Carolinians, we are asking the UNC Dean, Wesley Burks, to revoke the Task Force for Social Justice, and to say explicitly, we will commit to excellence and excellence only in our admissions and hiring. And we will teach only that which is medically relevant information for our students. And so I want you guys to go to our website, colorusunited.org, and sign the petition. colorusunited.org, right here. Boom. North Carolinians deserve better health care than what DEI provides. Do we want to be number one in DEI, or do we want to be number one in the nation in health care? We have plenty of opportunity. We're the 29th unhealthiest state in the nation. We have higher than average rates of diabetes, higher than average rates of Alzheimer's. And what Nche Zama and Dr. Zama has told us is that you can transform institutions from last to first. Why are we settling for anything less than the best in North Carolina? So tell your friends that. Tell your friends to sign our petition. With tens of thousands of signatures, we got the Salvation Army last year to rescind their task force to talk about racism, to blame their own officers for racism. And with tens of thousands of your signatures, we will do the same for woke healthcare. Yes?
Isn't it UNC where they also, isn't that where Dr. Tim Reeder is performing gender affirming surgeries on minors, I believe?
Yeah, he's definitely doing that.
Can that be worked into your petition to avert that?
Yes, yeah, and in fact, we are coming out with exposure and exposing the lowering of standards. What the real problem with this transgender affirming surgery is that
It's part of DEI too.
it is part of DEI, and it's what it.
That should be part of your.
It is. It's the lowering of scientific standards. There's no scientific standards to suggest that this is a long-term outcome that benefits these people. In fact, it's not. Go ahead.
I think this is a very crucial question, and it is obviously part of this. What we need to do here is have UNC disavow this, because that's where we are right now. And then the next step would be that, because that's a big one, because once they disavow it, you can approach that. Because gender is biology. I mean, as a physician, I can tell you categorically, you're taking perfectly healthy children and you're turning them into lifelong patients. There's a powerful platform there we have not pursued. But to do that right now may actually cause a little bit of, because these are major problems, major issues, but they're really a package. I think after this, that would be a very powerful one to take on, because you're taking that on from a position of strength at that time. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, guys.
Now, if anybody has any questions, and I'm really 100% supportive of what's going on here, and if you need to reach me, I'll give you my phone number and my email address. You can actually get it from him, or if you want, I can give it to you now. And just contact me. If you're somebody who's a little resistant that you're talking to, and you want me to call him and talk to him, I will. And